life. So I think that if we consider suffering as something that results when we forget our own sense of inner peace, or we forget our own sense of inner balance, then it becomes clear on some level that we choose suffering. And I know that for me, there are times in my life when I know damn well when I'm not ready to stop suffering, when I am ready to keep a grievance in my heart and not let it go, when I am ready to fight so hard to be right in a situation, when I know I just let it go, I could be happy. And I'm thinking of a situation that happened in my life just last week, and I was sitting there talking to Steve, and I said, please don't say anything, because I'm not defending myself. I realize I'm not in the right. I'm just not ready to be over this situation quite yet. And then when we think about something like illness or disease, some of even that is related to the choices that we have made as well. And so on some level, we choose to suffer. This is not a nihilistic proposition or a disheartening proposition, because if you choose to suffer, then if you raise your level of awareness, you can choose not to suffer. And I think it is important to say here that the degree to which this is a conscious or unconscious choice obviously varies depending on a person's level of awareness. So it's not necessarily that somebody thought on a super conscious level, well, gee, I'd really like to date this person who will be horrible to me. But perhaps on a deeper level, you had some view about yourself that was, I am not lovable, or I do not deserve to be treated with dignity, or I simply deserve to be tolerated, that then allowed you to choose it. So this is not something to launch at someone else and say, oh, well, you chose that. No, that isn't useful. But it is useful as a way of considering that if we think about our deep-seated thoughts and our deep-seated emotions, that we have an awful lot of control over what is happening in our lives. I think sometimes we suffer so much because we're so insistent on guarantees, of which there are so few, if any, in life. And so we forget that things are not permanent. I see this a lot in my work. People don't start a business, or they don't start some new venture because they're worried they might fail, or they're worried they might not meet their bottom line, or people don't give somebody a chance in terms of a relationship because they're afraid that they might let them down at some later date. And it's sort of like a Greek tragedy, like in trying to avoid any disappointment, in trying to avoid being let down in any way, it's often exactly what you bring to your doorstep. But what about those events that clearly do not seem like a choice? We might think of genocide, or Holocaust, or child abuse, or sexual assault. Those events that are so egregious, it is evident from a human perspective, we would in no way want to experience them. Perhaps, as some people have argued, we could say that we make a contract of sorts before we come here to experience certain things, to move our soul forward, to advance our soul. And I think this tells another part of the story. I think this provides a lot of closure for some people, because they're able to say, well, from my limited human perspective, of course I don't know all of the reasons for things, and of course I don't know why everything makes sense, but certainly if I had a vantage point that afforded me a universal perspective, I would understand these things, or I would understand the whole picture instead of just the tiny, tiny piece that I see. I accept this somewhat, given my work, especially with children coming through in readings and what they tell me, but also in what I've read in the past life regression literature, with people transitioning between lives, or so much of what I've read from different channeling and things like that. But here again, I just offer a slight caveat, which is that this should not be used as some form of escapism or some way to avoid us reducing the amount of needless suffering in the world. Because perhaps someone came here in some type of contractual way to experience assault, but if I witness that assault, who is to say that it was not part of my contract to stop it? And so this is useful in a million, billion variable, global, cosmic type of way to understand suffering. But I don't think that it is useful in a completely literal type of a way. So I accept this as kind of a global explanation, something to consider. Perhaps instead of saying, these events are predestined, that we have choices at different points. I mean, I think it is tone deaf to say, at a completely literal level, in the way that we understand choice, that the Jews chose to die in the Holocaust. I mean, perhaps that was some type of challenge for us, in which we should have woken up and done something about that in our world much, much before. So my point here is not that anybody chose anything or didn't choose anything, but to consider that perhaps it is also our reaction to all of these situations that is our choice. Perhaps it is our reaction to suffering and these things that provides an opportunity for us. So we cannot use this to explain away suffering. I was bullied so horribly growing up, and I can look back on that experience and say that I learned to be very strong, and I learned to use my own voice, and I learned to let go of what other people thought of me. And I can be grateful for that. But it took about 3 years into being bullied before a teacher finally stood up and said, "Enough is enough, this stops." And let me tell you, I learned so much more from that teacher saying that, from that act of courage, than I did from 3 years of being bullied. And so I think that we have to consider not so much was someone predestined to suffer, but in what ways can I bring spiritual truth to bear on the planet? In what way can I reduce the amount of needless suffering in my own heart and mind, and then certainly in the world around me? So if we keep all of these things kind of in mind, this idea of learning lessons, this idea of agreeing to participate in things, or this idea of agreeing to undergo certain things, I think the next thing that I want to propose to you fits in very nicely, which is the idea that suffering results because of the collective unconscious. We might think of there being a field that vibrates and vacillates around us at all times. We might think of, this is kind of like where your consciousness resides, like your consciousness rents your brain, it doesn't originate from your brain, so you might think of your consciousness vacillating in and out from this field at a very, very rapid rate all the time. So every thought, every emotion, every judgment, every attitude, every word, everything we then do in the world, good or bad, enters into the collective unconscious. It enters into this field of sorts, which then has everything to do with what actually happens in the world. So if we are putting in thoughts of lack, thoughts that there isn't enough money in the world, if we're putting in there thoughts that there isn't enough food, if we're putting in there thoughts of self-loathing, what happens is all those things vibrate then on a level of hate, they vibrate on a level of intolerance. So I loathe something about myself, I hate something about myself, I spend my lifetime affirming that belief in my mind. Perhaps I even attract a whole bunch of people that are more than willing to affirm that self-loathing belief that I have about myself. This gets supercharged millions and millions and millions of times, and then from that, wars erupt, from that, poverty erupts, from that, rape and domestic violence, genocide, all of the ills of the world erupt. But far from being defeatist, I find this so encouraging, because it And if you reread the studies on collective intention, it's just fascinating. It is just stunning how much modern science is validating this idea that what you think about, you bring about. And it's just stunning, what can I say? And so it gives me a lot of hope, because that means if we fill that field with thoughts of self-love, if we fill that field with thoughts of encouragement, with thoughts of genuineness, with thoughts of deep examination, with thoughts of deliberation and analysis and collaboration and fairness, then that is what we will have in the world. So instead of spontaneous outbreaks of war, we will have spontaneous outbreaks of diplomacy. Instead of famines, we will have, more and more people feeding the world. And that's why I'm so firmly committed to spiritual people playing a role in the issues of the day, and spiritual people not using their spirituality to disengage from the world, but using their spirituality as a way to more fully engage in the world, because otherwise it really just does devolve very quickly into narcissism. It really just devolves very quickly into escapism, because it becomes, well, I'm more spiritual than you, and I'm more evolved than you, and I can do 15 meditation techniques and you can only do 10. So that is not what I think we should be trying to do here. I mean, it's like, I love when Marianne Williamson writes, love is not neutral, love takes a stand. It is the commitment to the attainment of the conditions of peace for everyone involved in a situation. And I think this fits in then so nicely with the spiritual principle of we are all connected. So how do we resolve suffering? I think this is